Did you know your husband didn't trust your family? The lawyer asked me quietly, just as the last guest stepped out of the funeral home. I remember the smell of lilies still hanging heavy in the air, the kind people send when they don't know what else to say, and the soft murmur of distant conversations fading into the parking lot. I had just buried my husband of 41 years that morning, and all I wanted was to go home, sit in his chair, and pretend for a few minutes that nothing had changed. But instead, I found myself standing in a quiet corner near the hallway, facing a man in a gray suit who had known my husband longer than I realized. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" He glanced toward the door as if making sure we were alone, then reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small, unmarked USB drive. It looked ordinary, the kind you might find in a drawer next to old receipts and spare keys. But the way he held it, carefully, almost respectfully, made something in my chest tighten. "Your husband asked me to give you this," he said, placing it gently into my palm. "But not right away. He was very specific. 6 months from today." 6 months. The words echoed in my mind like a delayed alarm I couldn't quite turn off. I stared at the small device resting in my hand, suddenly aware of how cold it felt against my skin. "Why would he do that?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay composed. My husband had never been a man of secrets. He believed in clear conversations, in sitting at the kitchen table and talking things through, even when the truth was uncomfortable. That was who he was. Or at least who I thought he was. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his expression carefully neutral. But there was something behind it. Something he wasn't saying. "He told me you would understand when the time comes," he replied. "And he also asked me to tell you one more thing." I felt my breath catch. He said, "Trust your instincts. Not everything in your home is what it seems." For a moment I couldn't move. The world around me felt distant, like I was standing behind glass watching someone else's life unfold. My home. The place I had shared with him for decades. The place where our son had grown up, where birthdays were celebrated, where Sunday dinners filled the air with laughter and the smell of roasted chicken. "Nothing in your home is what it seems." I forced a small nod, closing my fingers around the USB drive, as if it might disappear if I loosened my grip. "Thank you," I said automatically, even though gratitude felt like the wrong response to whatever this was. The lawyer gave a brief, sympathetic smile before stepping away, leaving me alone with a question I didn't know how to ask. When I finally walked out into the afternoon light, I saw my son Daniel standing beside his wife, Ashley, near the curb. Ashley was checking her phone, her posture relaxed, almost impatient, while Daniel spoke quietly to a distant relative. They both looked up when they saw me, their expressions shifting into something softer, something rehearsed. "Mom, are you ready?" Daniel asked, opening the car door for me. I nodded again, slipping the USB drive into my coat pocket without thinking. As I approached, Ashley gave me a quick, polite smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "It was a beautiful service," she said. "He would have loved it." I murmured something in return, but my attention had already drifted elsewhere, to the way her gaze lingered for just a second too long on my pocket, as if she knew something I didn't. The ride home was quiet, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but heavy, filled with everything no one is saying. I watched the familiar streets pass by, each one carrying memories that suddenly felt fragile, like they could be rewritten without my permission. My husband had left me many things over the years. A house, a life, a family. But as I sat there, my hand resting over the small shape hidden in my coat, I couldn't shake the feeling that what he had really left me was a question. And somehow, I already knew that the answer wasn't going to bring me peace. I did not look at the USB drive that night. I told myself it was because I respected my husband's wishes, because if he had asked me to wait 6 months, then there must have been a reason for it. But the truth was simpler than that. I was afraid of what I might find. The house felt different when we walked in that afternoon, as if something invisible had shifted while we were gone. The air was still, the kind of stillness that settles in after a storm, not before one. I placed my purse on the entry table and paused for a moment, listening. No television, no radio, no sound of my husband moving through the kitchen, opening cabinets the way he always did when he thought I was not paying attention. Just silence. "Mom, you should sit down," Daniel said gently behind me. His voice was softer than usual, almost careful, like he was choosing each word before letting it out. It has been a long day. I nodded, letting him guide me into the living room, where everything looked exactly the same, and yet somehow unfamiliar. The same beige sofa. The same framed photographs on the wall. The same throw blanket folded neatly over the armrest. But the room felt larger now, emptier, as if it had lost its center. Ashley moved ahead of us, already adjusting things without asking. She straightened the pillows, picked up a magazine from the coffee table, and placed it neatly in a stack, her movements efficient and controlled. "You should not worry about anything right now," she said, her tone smooth, reassuring in a way that felt practiced. "Daniel and I will take care of everything." Everything. The word lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I lowered myself into the armchair across from the sofa. The one my husband used to joke was my throne because I always sat there during family gatherings, watching everyone else move around the room. From that seat, I could see the hallway leading to our bedroom, the door slightly open, the edge of his dresser just visible. For a brief moment I imagined him standing there, leaning against the frame, smiling the way he used to when he caught me lost in thought. But the hallway remained empty. "Mom," Daniel said again, sitting across from me, his elbows resting on his knees. "We have been talking, and we think it might be a good idea to make some changes around the house, just to make things easier for you." I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the fabric of the armrest. "What kind of changes?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Ashley stepped in before he could answer. "Nothing big," she said quickly. "Just practical things. Organizing paperwork, updating some accounts, making sure everything is streamlined." She smiled, but there was something behind it, something sharp that did not belong in a moment like this. "You should not have to worry about those details anymore." I studied her face for a second longer than usual, noticing the way her eyes flicked briefly toward Daniel, as if checking his reaction. He nodded, though not as confidently as she had spoken. "It is just temporary," he added. "Until things settle down." Until things settle down. I had heard that phrase before, usually when something permanent was about to be decided without me. I shifted slightly in my chair, my hand brushing against my coat pocket where the USB drive rested, small and unnoticed. "I have managed this house for over 30 years, I said quietly. "I think I can handle a few details." The room fell silent for a moment, the kind of silence that reveals more than words ever could. Ashley's smile did not disappear, but it changed, tightening just enough to make it feel less like kindness and more like patience wearing thin. "Of course you can," she said, her voice light, almost dismissive. "We are just trying to help." Help. Another word that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Daniel stood up, running a hand through his hair the way he used to when he was a teenager trying to avoid a difficult conversation. "We will talk about it later," he said quickly. "You should get some rest." I nodded again because it was easier than arguing, and watched as they moved toward the kitchen, their voices lowering the moment they thought I could no longer hear them. I did not catch the words, only the tone. Urgent. Controlled. Familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. After a few minutes I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway. The house creaked softly beneath my steps, the same familiar sounds that had once comforted me now feeling strangely distant. When I reached the bedroom, I paused at the doorway, my eyes moving over the room we had shared for decades. His side of the bed was still untouched. His watch still rested on the nightstand exactly where he had left it. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing felt right. I reached into my pocket and took out the USB drive, holding it between my fingers, turning it slightly in the dim light. Such a small thing. So quiet. And somehow it felt louder than anything else in the house. "Trust your instincts," the lawyer had said. "Not everything in your home is what it seems." I closed my hand around the device again, my heartbeat slow but steady now. No longer just grief but something else beginning to take shape beneath it. I was not ready to open it. Not yet. But for the first time since the funeral, I realized something I could not ignore. Whatever my husband had left for me, it was not just a memory. It was a warning. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because something inside me refused to rest. The house was quiet, But it was not the peaceful kind of quiet I had known for years. It was watchful, almost expectant, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, staring at the empty space beside me, then slowly stood and walked toward the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee reached me before I even turned the corner, which made me pause. My husband had always been the one who woke up early to brew it, measuring each scoop carefully like it was a ritual. But now he was gone, and yet the coffee was already made. When I stepped into the kitchen, Ashley was standing by the counter, scrolling through her phone with one hand while the other rested lightly on a stack of papers. She looked up when she saw me and smiled, that same polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Good morning," she said brightly. "I thought you could use some coffee." I nodded slowly, my gaze drifting to the papers beside her. They were neatly arranged, clipped together, the kind of documents that suggested decisions had already been made. "What is all that?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Ashley followed my gaze and let out a small laugh, as if the question was harmless. "Just some things we need to organize," she said. "Accounts, insurance, property details. Nothing you need to worry about." There it was again. That phrase. Nothing you need to worry about. I stepped closer, reaching for the coffee mug she had already set out for me, and let my eyes linger on the top page just long enough to recognize my husband's name printed in bold letters across the header. "I would like to see them," I said quietly. For a fraction of a second something flickered across her face. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by that same calm expression, but I had seen it. "Of course," she replied, though her hand moved slightly, pulling the papers closer to her side of the counter. "We were just going to go over everything with you later. Daniel wanted to be here for that." As if on cue, Daniel walked into the kitchen, adjusting the sleeve of his shirt, his expression already tense. "Mom, you are up early," he said, glancing briefly at Ashley before looking back at me. There was a hesitation there, subtle but unmistakable. "We were just talking about getting everything organized," Ashley added smoothly, stepping back just enough to give him space, but not enough to relinquish control of the papers. Daniel nodded, though his eyes did not quite meet mine. "It is just temporary," he said again, repeating the same line from the day before. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest as I studied them both. Two people standing in my kitchen, speaking about my life as if I were not fully part of it. "Handled properly," I repeated softly. "By whom?" The question lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. Ashley was the first to respond, her voice light but firm. "By us, of course. We are family." Family. I had spent decades believing that word meant something solid, something unbreakable. But now, standing there in my own kitchen, it felt like a word that could be reshaped depending on who was speaking it. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, running his hand along the back of his neck. "Mom, we are just trying to help," he said, his voice quieter now. "There are things you should not have to deal with alone." I set my cup down gently on the counter, careful not to let it make too much noise. "And what makes you think I am alone?" I asked. Neither of them answered right away. Ashley's smile softened slightly, but there was something calculating in the way she tilted her head, as if she were deciding how much to say. "You are not alone," she said finally. "That is exactly why we are here." Her words were reassuring on the surface, but the tone beneath them told a different story. It was not support. It was control wrapped carefully in kindness. I glanced once more at the stack of documents, then back at Daniel, searching for something familiar in his expression, something that reminded me of the boy who used to come to me with every problem, every question. But what I saw instead was distance. Not anger. Not cruelty. Just distance. And somehow that felt worse. "I think I would like some time," I said calmly, "to go through things myself." Ashley's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the papers, though her smile remained in place. "Of course," she said again, but this time the words sounded different. Less like agreement. More like delay. Daniel nodded quickly. "That is fine," he said. "We can talk about it later." Later. Another word that promised time while quietly taking it away. I picked up my coffee and turned toward the window, looking out at the backyard where my husband had spent so many afternoons tending to the garden. The chairs were still there, the small table between them untouched, as if he might walk out at any moment and sit down like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Not just his absence but everything around it. I slipped my hand into my pocket, feeling the small solid shape of the USB drive resting there, hidden from view but impossible to ignore. For the first time I began to understand that whatever answers it held, they were already unfolding around me, in quiet conversations, in careful smiles, in decisions made just out of my reach. And the most unsettling part was not what I did not know. It was the growing sense that the people closest to me were counting on me never finding out. That afternoon, I found myself standing in the backyard longer than I intended, my hands resting lightly on the back of one of the chairs my husband used to sit in every evening. The wood was still warm from the sun, and for a moment I closed my eyes and let myself imagine that nothing had changed, that he would step outside any second with 2 glasses of iced tea, the way he always did without asking. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by a quiet awareness that the life I thought I understood had begun to unravel in ways I had not yet fully seen. I went back inside slowly, not because I was tired but because I needed to be. I needed to observe, to listen, to understand the rhythm of this new version of my home. The kitchen was empty when I returned, but the stack of papers was gone. That alone was enough to make me pause. I walked over to the counter and ran my fingers lightly across the surface where they had been, as if I might still feel the outline of something that had already been moved. They had not even pretended to leave them out for me. Whatever those documents were, they were no longer meant for my eyes, at least not yet. I turned toward the hallway and noticed something else that made me stop. The small cabinet near the entryway, the one where we kept spare keys and a few important envelopes, was slightly ajar. It was never left open. My husband had always been particular about that, insisting everything had its place. I stepped closer and opened it fully. The envelopes were still there, but they had been rearranged, shifted just enough that I could tell someone had gone through them recently. Not carelessly. Deliberately. I closed the cabinet slowly, my movements calm, controlled, even as a quiet tension settled in my chest. Later that evening I sat in the living room while Daniel and Ashley spoke in the kitchen, their voices low but not low enough to disappear completely. I could not make out every word, but I caught fragments. "Timing," Ashley said at one point. "We need to be careful with the timing." There was a pause, then Daniel's voice, softer, uncertain. "She might notice." I did not move. I did not react. I simply sat there, my eyes fixed on the photograph across the room of the 3 of us taken years ago, back when everything felt uncomplicated. Ashley's voice came again, more confident this time. "She will not. Not if we do this right." The words settled over me like a quiet confirmation of something I had already begun to suspect. This was not concern. This was planning. When they entered the living room a few minutes later, their expressions were composed, almost effortless. Ashley smiled as she sat down, crossing her legs neatly. "We were thinking about making a few adjustments to the house," she said, her tone casual, as if continuing a conversation that had never been paused. "Nothing major. Just small updates to make things more manageable." I looked at her, really looked this time, noticing the precision in the way she chose her words, the way each sentence was designed to sound reasonable, helpful, inevitable. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked. Daniel shifted slightly beside her, but did not speak. Ashley leaned forward just enough to suggest openness. "We could start by reorganizing the bedrooms," she said. "This house is bigger than you need now. It might be easier if you moved into one of the smaller rooms. Something more comfortable." Something more comfortable. I felt the words settle in, each one carefully placed, each one carrying a meaning that went far beyond what was being said. My bedroom. The room I had shared with my husband for over 4 decades. The room where every memory still lived quietly, in the details no one else would notice. "I am comfortable where I am," I said simply. Ashley's smile did not falter, but there was a slight tightening at the corners, a subtle shift that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been paying attention. "Of course," she replied. "We are just exploring options." Options. Another word that sounded harmless until you listened closely enough. Daniel finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "It is just an idea, Mom. Nothing has been decided." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I understood something they did not realize I had already begun to see. Decisions were being made. Just not with me. As the conversation drifted to other topics, I leaned back in my chair, my hand resting lightly in my lap, my fingers brushing against the fabric of my pocket. The USB drive was still there, small, silent, waiting. I had thought it was something meant for later, something distant, something I could choose to face when I was ready. But sitting there listening to the careful tone of their voices, watching the quiet coordination between them, I began to understand that whatever it contained was not just about the future. It was about the present, about this moment, about everything unfolding around me in ways they believed I would not question. And for the first time, the thought crossed my mind with a clarity that felt almost unsettling. Maybe my husband had not asked me to wait because the truth was not ready. Maybe he had asked me to wait because he knew I would need to see all of this for myself first. That night, I did not join them for dinner. I told them I was not hungry, which was not entirely untrue, but it was not the real reason. The real reason was that I needed silence, the kind of silence that allows thoughts to surface without interruption. I sat in my bedroom with the door slightly closed, not fully shut, just enough to hear the faint sounds of movement from the rest of the house. Cabinets opening. Plates being set down. The low murmur of voices carefully kept out of reach. I had spent most of my life believing that love made things visible, that the people closest to you would always be the easiest to understand. But now, I was beginning to see how much could exist just beneath the surface, hidden not by distance but by familiarity. I stood up slowly and walked to the dresser, my eyes resting on the photograph of my husband that I had placed there years ago. It was taken on a summer afternoon, his sleeves rolled up, a soft smile on his face as he looked just past the camera, as if he had already noticed something the rest of us had not. "What did you see?" I whispered quietly, my voice barely filling the room. The question lingered unanswered, but it did not feel empty. It felt like an invitation to remember. And slowly pieces began to return to me, not all at once but in small, quiet fragments. Conversations I had not thought about in years. Moments that had once seemed insignificant. The way he used to pause when Ashley spoke, not interrupting, not disagreeing, just watching. The way he had started handling certain financial matters himself, even when I offered to help. The night he had come into the bedroom later than usual, sitting at the edge of the bed without saying anything for a long time. At the time I had assumed it was stress or fatigue, or simply one of those things people do not always explain. But now, standing there in the quiet, I began to see those moments differently. Not as random details but as patterns. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap, and let the memories settle into place. There had been a conversation about a year ago, one I had almost forgotten entirely. We had been sitting in the backyard, the sun just beginning to set, the light stretching long across the grass. He had looked at me not casually, but with a kind of intention that I did not fully understand at the time. "If anything ever feels off," he had said, his voice calm but deliberate, "do not ignore it." I remember laughing lightly, brushing it off the way people do when they do not want to imagine something being wrong. "You have always been the cautious one," I had told him. He had smiled, but it had not reached his eyes. "That is because I have learned that not everything shows itself right away." I had not asked him what he meant. I had not needed to. At least that is what I told myself then. But now, sitting in that same house, hearing the careful movements of the people in the next room, I understood something I had missed before. He had not been speaking in general terms. He had been warning me. A soft sound from the hallway pulled me back to the present. I turned my head slightly, listening as footsteps passed by my door, then paused. For a brief moment I thought someone might knock. No one did. The footsteps continued, fading slowly into the distance. I stood up again and walked to the door, opening it just enough to look out. The hallway was empty, but the light from the kitchen spilled faintly across the floor, stretching toward me like a quiet invitation. I stepped back inside and closed the door gently, my hand resting against it for a moment longer than necessary. Then without rushing I reached into my pocket and took out the USB drive. Felt different now. Not just a mystery but a message. Not just something left behind but something meant to be found at the right moment. I turned it over in my hand, studying its plain surface, wondering how something so small could carry so much weight. 6 months, he had said. But the more I thought about it, the more that number felt less like a deadline and more like a window. A period of time meant for observation, for understanding, for seeing things clearly before acting. I walked over to the desk in the corner of the room, where my laptop sat closed and untouched since the day before. I placed the USB drive beside it, not inserting it, not yet, but no longer hiding it either. I sat down slowly, my gaze fixed on the small device as if it might reveal something on its own. Outside, the evening settled into night, the house growing quieter with each passing minute. But inside me, something had begun to shift. The uncertainty was still there, the questions still unanswered. But beneath it all, there was something steadier now. Not fear, not hesitation, something else, something closer to clarity. And for the first time since the funeral, I realized that whatever truth was waiting for me, I was no longer trying to avoid it. I was preparing to face it. I did not wait until morning. The house had gone completely quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after everyone has gone to bed, when even the smallest sound feels louder than it should. I sat at the desk, the soft glow of the lamp casting a narrow circle of light across the surface, and stared at the USB drive resting beside my laptop. For a long moment I did nothing. My hand hovered near it, then pulled back, then returned again, as if I needed to cross some invisible line before I could move forward. 6 months, he had said. But nothing in this house felt like it was meant to wait. I reached for the laptop, opened it slowly, and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, the familiar startup sound filling the room in a way that felt strangely loud in the silence. I glanced once toward the door, listening, making sure no footsteps approached, no voices stirred. Nothing. Just the quiet. I picked up the USB drive and held it for a second longer, feeling the weight of the decision settle into my chest. Then I inserted it. The screen paused for a moment, then a small window appeared, showing a single folder. No label beyond a date. My fingers hesitated over the trackpad, then moved. I clicked. Inside there were several files. Not many, just enough to suggest intention. The first file was a video. The second was a document. The third was a folder labeled simply Records. I did not open the video right away. Instead, I stared at the list, my breath steady but slower now, as if my body understood that whatever came next would change something I could not undo. I moved the cursor and opened the document first. It was not long. Just a few paragraphs, written in my husband's voice, clear and direct. He had always been a man who chose his words carefully, and even on the screen I could feel that same presence. If you are reading this, it began, then it means you chose not to wait. That is all right. In fact, it tells me I was right about you. I felt my throat tighten slightly, but I kept reading. There are things I could not say out loud. Not because I did not trust you, but because I needed you to see them without influence. You deserve to understand what is happening around you with your own eyes. I paused, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk, grounding myself before continuing. Over the past year, I began to notice patterns. Small at first, easy to dismiss, but consistent. Decisions being made without discussion. Accounts being accessed in ways that did not match our records. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. My heart beat a little faster, not from shock but from recognition. These were not new ideas. They were confirmations of what I had already begun to feel. I did not confront them, he continued. Not immediately. I needed to be certain. And once I needed to make sure you would be protected. Protected. The word lingered, heavy with meaning. I scrolled further down. The files included here will show you what I found. I ask only one thing. Do not act too quickly. Observe. Let them reveal themselves. The truth is more powerful when it is seen clearly, not forced into the light. Sat back slightly, the room feeling smaller now, more focused, as if everything had narrowed to this single moment. Slowly, I moved the cursor again and opened the folder labeled Records. Inside were documents, bank statements, transaction histories, email printouts, each one carefully organized, dated, annotated in small notes written in my husband's precise handwriting. I opened one at random. A transfer, a significant amount, moved from one account to another. The names were familiar. Too familiar. I opened another. An email thread. Short messages. Polite on the surface. but beneath them a pattern. Requests. Approvals. Silence where there should have been questions. I felt a slow, steady shift inside me. Not panic, not disbelief, but something far more unsettling. Understanding. This was not confusion. This was design. I closed the folder and returned to the main screen, my eyes settling on the video file. For a moment I simply looked at it, my reflection faintly visible in the dark edge of the screen. Then I clicked. The image appeared slowly, the camera slightly angled, as if it had been set up quickly but intentionally. And there he was, sitting in the same chair in the backyard, the one I had stood beside just hours earlier. He looked calm, tired perhaps but steady, like a man who had already made his decisions. He looked directly into the camera, and for a moment it felt like he was looking at me. "If you are watching this," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "then you already know something is not right." I did not move. I did not breathe. I simply listened, because in that moment I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not the beginning of the truth. It was the continuation of something that had been unfolding long before I was ready to see it. He did not raise his voice in the video. He never needed to. Even through the screen there was a calm certainty in the way he spoke, the kind that made every word feel heavier than it should. "I wanted to be wrong," he said, his hands resting loosely on his knees. "I told myself more than once that I was reading too much into things, that I was just being cautious. But patterns do not lie. And once you see them clearly, you cannot unsee them." I leaned closer to the screen. Without realizing it, as if the distance between us could somehow be shortened, the room around me faded into the background. "Ashley is not careless," he continued. "Everything she does has intention behind it. She is patient. That is what makes her dangerous. She does not rush. She waits for the right moment. And when it comes, she acts as if the decision was always inevitable." My fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the desk. The words did not feel like accusations. They felt like observations carefully gathered over time. "At first it was small things," he said. "Questions about accounts. Suggestions about how to simplify finances. Requests to help manage certain details. Nothing unreasonable on its own. That is how it begins." I thought back to the conversations in the kitchen, the careful tone, the repeated phrases. "Nothing you need to worry about. We are just trying to help." The same pattern unfolding again. "Then it became access," he continued. "Passwords shared under the idea of convenience. Documents reviewed under the idea of organization. And once access becomes normal, control follows quietly behind it." I swallowed slowly, my eyes fixed on his face. He looked tired but not defeated. Focused. "Daniel," he said after a brief pause, and something in his expression shifted just slightly. "Daniel is not the problem. But he is not the solution either. He wants things to be easy. He avoids conflict. And that makes him adaptable." The word hung in the air longer than the others. Adaptable. Not malicious. Not cruel. But willing to go along. I exhaled slowly, the truth of it settling into place with an unsettling clarity. "I watched them," he said. "Not in a way that would alarm them. Just enough to understand the rhythm of their decisions. The timing. The way conversations would pause when I entered the room. The way certain topics would only come up when I was not present." I felt a faint chill move through me, not from fear but from recognition. I had noticed those things too. I just had not given them weight. "You might be wondering why I did not confront them," he continued, his gaze steady. "The answer is simple. Confrontation changes behavior. Does not reveal it. I needed to see the truth as it existed when they believed no one was watching." I sat back slightly, letting those words settle. Confrontation changes behavior. Does not reveal it. I had spent my life believing the opposite. "What you will find in the records," he said, "is not one moment, not one mistake, but a pattern of decisions that lead in the same direction. Slowly, quietly, deliberately." He paused just for a second, as if choosing what to say next with care. "I did not want to believe that our home could become something else. But I also knew that if I ignored what I was seeing, I would be leaving you unprepared. And that was not something I could allow." My eyes blurred for a moment, but I did not look away. I could not. "If you are watching this now," he said, his voice softer but no less certain. Then you have already begun to notice what I noticed. The tone of their voices, the timing of their decisions, the way things shift just slightly out of your reach. I thought of the papers disappearing from the counter, the cabinet left slightly open, the quiet conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Do not rush to act, he said again. That is what they expect. They expect emotion, reaction. What they do not expect is patience. He leaned back slightly in the chair, his expression calm, almost reassuring. You are stronger than you think, and you are more observant than you realize. Trust that. The screen went still for a moment as the video ended, leaving me alone with the faint reflection of my own face staring back at me. I did not move right away. I did not reach for the next file. I simply sat there, letting everything settle into place. The confusion was gone now. Not completely, but enough to reveal something clearer beneath it. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a series of unfortunate choices. It was a direction, and I was standing in the middle of it, expected to follow along without question. Slowly, I closed the laptop, the screen fading to black as the room returned to its quiet state. My hand rested lightly on the lid for a moment, steady, controlled. Then I stood up. The house was still silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt active, like something was moving just beneath the surface, waiting. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized something with complete certainty. They were not the only ones who had been observing. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I had not felt in days. Not peace, not comfort, but clarity. The kind that settles in quietly after a truth has been seen and cannot be unseen. I did not reach for the laptop again. I did not need to. What I had already read, what I had already heard, was enough to change the way I looked at everything around me. Instead, I got dressed slowly, choosing a simple outfit, the same kind I had worn 100 times before. Nothing that would draw attention or suggest anything had shifted inside me. When I walked into the kitchen, Ashley was already there again, just like the morning before, standing in the same place, moving with the same controlled efficiency. If anything, the routine made her easier to read now. Good morning, she said, her tone warm, practiced. I was just about to make breakfast. I smiled politely, matching her tone, letting my expression remain calm, unchanged. That sounds nice, I replied. My voice felt steady, almost detached, as if I were listening to someone else speak. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, his movements slower, his eyes briefly meeting mine before shifting away again. That hesitation. I saw it clearly now. Not guilt exactly, but awareness. He knew something was not right. He just was not willing to name it. We sat down at the table together, the same table where so many ordinary moments had unfolded over the years. Plates, coffee, small talk. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. I was thinking, Ashley said casually as she set down a plate in front of me, we could start reviewing some of the documents today, just to make sure everything is in order. I took a small sip of my coffee, letting a brief pause settle between us before answering. That would be helpful, I said calmly. I saw the quick exchange of glances between them. Subtle, almost invisible. But I caught it. They had expected resistance, hesitation. Instead, I gave them agreement. And that changed something in the room. Ashley's smile widened slightly, more genuine this time, though still controlled. Great, she said. I will bring everything out after breakfast. I nodded, lowering my gaze to my plate, allowing the moment to pass without adding anything more. Inside, I was already thinking several steps ahead. After breakfast, she brought the papers back, placing them neatly on the table between us. The same stack I had seen the day before. Only now they were being presented as if they had always been meant for me. We can go through these together, she said, sitting across from me. Daniel took the seat beside her, his posture slightly tense, his hands resting flat against the table. I reached for the top document and began to read. Slowly, carefully. Not because I needed time to understand it, but because I wanted them to believe I did. The numbers, the transfers, the small adjustments that had once seemed insignificant now stood out clearly, each one fitting into the pattern my husband had described. I asked simple questions, neutral questions. When was this account updated? Who authorized this transfer? My tone remained calm, almost curious, never confrontational. Ashley answered each one smoothly, her explanations polished, consistent. Too consistent. Daniel added small details occasionally, but his voice lacked the same certainty. He was following her lead. Exactly as my husband had said. I nodded at their answers, occasionally making a small note on a piece of paper beside me, not because I needed to remember, but because I wanted them to think I did. The more I observed, the clearer it became. This was not improvisation. This was structure. A plan that had been building over time, designed to feel gradual, reasonable, inevitable. It all looks very organized, I said after a while, setting the papers down gently. Ashley smiled, leaning back slightly in her chair. We just want to make things easier for you, she said again. I met her eyes directly this time, holding her gaze just long enough to register the shift, the slight tightening behind her smile. I appreciate that, I replied, and I meant it. Not for the reason she thought, but because her consistency made the truth easier to see. The rest of the day passed quietly. Conversations stayed light. Movement stayed predictable. But everything I saw, everything I heard, added another layer to what I already knew. By the evening, the house had returned to its usual rhythm, but I no longer moved through it the same way. I was no longer reacting. I was observing. And that changed everything. Later that night, as I stood by the window looking out at the darkened yard, my reflection faintly visible in the glass, I understood something with absolute certainty. I did not need to confront them. Not yet. I did not need to explain what I knew. Not yet. What I needed was time. Time to watch. Time to let them continue exactly as they had been. Because the more comfortable they felt, the more clearly they would reveal themselves. And this time I would not miss it. The following morning, I suggested we have dinner together that evening, just the three of us, at the same table where everything had begun to shift. I kept my tone light, almost thoughtful, as if I simply wanted to bring some sense of normalcy back into the house. Ashley agreed immediately, her smile quick and approving, while Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Throughout the day, I moved as I had the day before, calm, observant, saying little but noticing everything. Ashley spent part of the afternoon on the phone in the other room, her voice lowered, her words too quiet to make out, but her tone sharp in a way that no longer escaped me. Daniel stayed close to her, as if waiting for direction, occasionally glancing in my direction when he thought I was not looking. By the time evening arrived, everything was in place. The table was set. The same plates. The same glasses. The same arrangement that had once meant comfort and routine. But tonight it felt like a stage. I took my seat first, folding my hands neatly in front of me, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. When they joined me, I noticed the way Ashley scanned the table briefly, her eyes moving quickly, as if confirming that everything was exactly as expected. This is nice, she said, settling into her chair. It has been a while since we all sat down together like this. I nodded slightly. Yes, I replied. It has. We began with small talk. Safe topics. The weather. The neighbors. A brief mention of a call Daniel had received earlier in the day. Ashley spoke easily, guiding the conversation with the same quiet control she had shown in everything else. Daniel followed along, adding details where needed, his tone steady but not fully at ease. I let them speak. I let the rhythm settle. And then when the moment felt right, I reached into my pocket and placed the USB drive gently on the table between us. The movement was small, almost casual, but the effect was immediate. Ashley's smile paused just for a second. Daniel's hand, which had been reaching for his glass, stopped halfway. I watched them both, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a quiet clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. I received this after the funeral, I said, my voice even measured. From his lawyer. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thin but unbroken. Ashley was the first to recover, her expression smoothing over as quickly as it had shifted. What is it? She asked lightly, though the question came a fraction too quickly. I met her gaze directly. Something he wanted me to have, I replied. I let a brief pause follow, just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle. In 6 months. Daniel's eyes moved to the USB drive, then back to me. 6 months, he repeated, his voice quieter now. I nodded. That is what he said. I did not mention that I had already seen what was inside. I did not need to. The uncertainty alone was enough. Ashley leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture still composed, but there was a new tension beneath it now, something more alert, more cautious. That is unusual, she said carefully. Did he say why? I allowed myself a small, almost thoughtful smile. No, I said. But he did say something else. I watched them closely, noting every shift, every flicker of expression. He told me to trust my instincts, I continued, and that not everything in this house is what it seems. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Heavier. More precise. Daniel looked down at the table, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his plate. Ashley did not look away. Instead, she held my gaze, her expression steady, calculating. I am sure he just meant that things can feel different after a loss, she said, her voice calm, controlled. It is a difficult time. I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. Yes, I said. It is. I let the moment linger, then reached for the USB drive, and turned it slightly between my fingers, the small movement drawing their attention back to it. I think I will wait, I added, my tone thoughtful. 6 months is not such a long time. Ashley's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. Daniel exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly. But I saw it. I saw the release. And that was enough. I placed the USB drive back on the table, leaving it there, visible, present. A quiet reminder. In the meantime, I continued, my voice steady, I would like us to keep things exactly as they are. No changes. No adjustments. No decisions made without all of us present. Ashley's smile returned, carefully measured. Of course, she said. That makes sense. Daniel nodded quickly. Yes, Mom. Of course. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my gaze moving between them one last time before settling. The conversation shifted again after that, back to safer ground, but something had changed. Not just for them. For me. Because now I was no longer waiting to understand what was happening. I understood. And I had made my choice. I would let them believe I was still in the dark. I would let them continue exactly as they had been. Because the truth, as my husband had said, was far more powerful when it revealed itself. And this time when it did, I would be ready.